Hi, my name is Justine, and I have a degree in technical theater with a focus in costume from the University of South Carolina. I also happen to be a person with multiple chronic illnesses, and I've used masks for the last several years. Believe it or not, before this pandemic, I had never made my own homemade mask, but shortly after the pandemic started, a close friend of mine and her mom started a Facebook group called Masks for Frontline Heroes. They put all the difficult research into finding a pattern and figuring out what made a homemade mask as medically effective as possible. Shortly after I joined the group, I volunteered to apply my sewing knowledge to all of their research and make tutorials that would be approachable and usable by sewists of all levels. So before we get into those tutorials, I just wanted to show you what a finished mask should look like, what our goals are with this mask, and how we achieve those goals. I should also say that the tutorials you're about to watch were originally filmed to be watched one by one as the process was happening, so if they seem a little disjointed, that's why. They weren't originally made to be watched back to back all at once. So this is what your finished mask should look like. And this is the lining. Our 4 goals with this mask are to provide a layer of filtration, to limit the amount of air that's unfiltered and coming in through the top, bottom, and sides of the mask as much as possible. We want it to be quick and easy to use, and we want it to be durable and possible to sterilize or wash. So, how do we do that? The most important thing is your materials. You want to make sure that you're using 100% tightly woven cotton. There's a few reasons for this. Cotton is easier to pull air through than polyester or synthetic fabrics, but it is also shown in research that cotton is better at catching virus-causing particles. It's also important because, especially if you're donating these to medical professionals, a lot of them will be putting this in an autoclave, which is a medical grade sterilizer, and those get very, 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 very hot, which means that anything that's polyester or a poly blend will melt and then not be usable anymore. So we also want to make sure that there is a pocket to put in a filter or a reusable flannel insert, which is what we have in this case, and a nose pinch clip, which is what this stitch, top stitch here, is holding in place. So it's important that the nose pinch clip is removable for certain medical professionals. For example, someone that's working in close proximity with an MRI machine. But it's important that there's a place for the nose pinch clip because that nose pinch clip helps hold the mask flush around your nose, which again limits the amount of unfiltered air that's coming in through the top, and that's important. The other thing that helps make this version of the medical mask or the homemade mask more effective is that it has channels holding the elastic or ties in place rather than just being top stitched in place. I can demonstrate why this is important because the first round of masks I made actually did just have elastic top stitched at the top and bottom. So I'm going to demonstrate on this doll. Her face is obviously a little smaller than mine, but you'll get the idea. So when we put the mask on her and stretch the elastic back, you can see that there's this gap that allows unfiltered air to come in through the side. But when I hold the mask in place that has the channel, that gap goes away, which limits the amount of unfiltered air that can come in through the side. The other thing that maybe you noticed, especially on the doll with the small head, is that the elastic might seem a little long to you. We did cut our elastic at 9 inches, but the reason for that is that it's way easier to shorten elastic once someone receives the mask than it is to make the elastic longer. If someone gets this and they need to tighten the elastic down to make sure it lays flush against their face, they can slide this out and untie the knot and retie it to be tighter. Or if it's stitched, if it's flat elastic that's stitched, they can just put in some extra stitches or tie it. Whereas if it's too short, then they have to find more elastic or find ties, and that becomes more difficult to use. We also feel that it's important to top stitch. As you can see, once this mask is finished, there are no raw edges visible. And that is important because raw edges being exposed means they're going to unravel faster. Making sure that all our raw edges are top stitched and encased here means that it's going to last longer and be more durable. It also means that if you're washing this at home, when you take it out of the dryer, it's ready to use. You don't have to reshape it or iron it. You can just put it on your face. So probably the most noticeable thing about this mask is that the outside and the inside lining pieces are made out of different fabric. The reason for that is that we want to make sure whoever's using these masks puts the same side of the mask on their face every single time. So if someone's wearing this for the first half of the day and then takes it off to eat lunch and then puts it back on, you don't want to swap germs with the outside world. You want to keep your germs to yourself and the outside world's germs out there. Putting this on with the lining toward your face also ensures that the channel helps keep that pocket closed. If you put this on inside out, that pocket isn't cinched closed. So it's important that it's worn correctly as well. The last thing that's important before we get into the sewing portion and actual making portion of this is that when you print out the pattern that comes with this tutorial, you want to make sure that you check your scale. So when you print it out, at the top right corner, there will be a little box that says in it or near it 1 inch. Take your tape measure or your quilting ruler and measure that box and make sure that all sides of it are actually 1 inch long. And that will ensure that when you cut out your paper pattern, your pattern's actually the right size. If you start out with a pattern that's too big or too small, your mask is not going to be the right size when it's finished. So I hope that all of this information has been helpful, and good luck! In this video, we'll go over what you need to do to make sure your fabric is ready to use. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you wash your 100% tightly woven cotton fabric on the hottest setting that your washer has. My washer actually has a sanitized setting, and if your washer has that, that is ideal. If not, just look at the different heat settings on your washer and choose the one that's the hottest. I've posted some pictures of what my washer looks like so you can see an example of the settings, but obviously everyone's washer is going to be a little bit different. If you have trouble figuring this out, please feel free to message me. It's what I'm here for, and you can even send me pictures and we'll figure it out together. So the next thing you're going to want to do is iron your fabric. So as you can see, this fabric does have a few creases on it. And the reason it's important to iron your fabric before you cut it is because if you've got a crease in your fabric, it'll distort the pattern a little bit as you're cutting it out. So especially, this isn't so bad, but especially if you've got a fold like this, if you pin your pattern down on top of this and then go to cut it, it's not going to be the right shape or size. We want to make sure that everything we're cutting is consistent so that our finished mask can be consistent. So the correct way to iron fabric for cutting is to make sure that you're going either across or up and down on the fabric. And I use lots and lots of steam. If you've got a crease that is particularly set in well, or you accidentally iron a crease like I did just there, there is a setting on many irons that's a spray setting. So I don't think you're close enough to see this, but this button is a steam setting, and this button has a picture of some dotted lines on it that's supposed to represent the spray setting. So what you do, if you have a particularly setting crease, you can see this is where the water is going to come out of my iron. Here, there's this little bump. You want to aim that down at your fabric and spray it a couple of times. And then when you iron over your crease, again, make sure you're only going side to side or up and down. If you've already sprayed water on your fabric, you don't need to use any steam, because the water is essentially creating steam as the hot iron dries it. And what you want to make sure that you do is iron your fabric until it is completely crease-free and dry. So when I say that it's important to make sure you're going either side to side or up and down when you're ironing your fabric, what you want to make sure you don't do is iron in a diagonal like that. And that's because the threads in fabric go side to side when it's made. They're stretched side to side across a machine that basically has a bunch of pins on it. And then more fibers are woven this way to create the fabric. So if you iron diagonally, or as we're going to talk about in a little bit, if you put your pattern on the diagonal when you cut it, what that does is instead of your threads in your fabric being perpendicular to each other, they cross and become diagonal to each other. And when you iron diagonally, it stretches the fabric out on the diagonal, so it distorts the shape of the fabric just a little bit. It might not seem like a huge deal, but ultimately what that does is it distorts the shape just enough so that if you were to iron it incorrectly and then lay your pattern down on your slightly distorted fabric, when the fabric cools off and settles, it's gonna be a little bit warped, and that isn't great. So, what we want to make sure we're doing is ironing side to side or up and down along our fabric until it's completely crease-free, and we want to make sure it's dry before we cut. Again, the reason that we want to make sure our fabric is dry is because some fabric and certain weaves can get a little bit distorted when they're wet. So it's important to make sure they're totally dry before you cut them so that you don't have shrinkage after you've cut your pattern or distortion after you've cut your pattern. The more consistently we cut, the more consistently we can make sure our finish masks are correct. In this tutorial, we'll be going over how to cut your fabric. I will be using this sunflower fabric for the outside, just so you can see an example of the proper way to cut something, or a faster way to cut something. You want to fold your fabric so your right sides of the fabric are together, and you're looking at the back side of your fabric. When you lay out your pattern, it is very important that you lay it out either this way or this way, so that the fibers in the fabric, the threads, are going this way and this way. What you don't want to do is cut it on the diagonal like this. even if it saves you fabric, it will create a stretch in the mask that we don't want. So, that said, I will be pinning my mask pattern to the fabric. And then this is ready to cut out. Ta-da! Now that we've got our outside fabric cut out, this is where you will be happy that you cut them right sides together. So you know that they match up perfectly now, and eventually we'll be sewing this curved seam in the front. So you can go ahead, if you like pins, which I do, I'm a big proponent of pins, and pin this front piece together, this front curve. So now we're gonna set that outside layer to the side, and we're gonna cut out a lining layer. I am going to use this green fabric. So we're using the same pattern. The only difference is we're gonna fold it along this dotted line here. So that just folds back. And this fabric, since it's not a print, doesn't really have a right side. But again, we wanna make sure that we're cutting everything so that the thread of our fabric is running this way and this way. That prevents it from stretching in a way that will cause problems for the wearer later. So I'm just going to pin this fabric, and then once I've got it pinned and cut out, we'll be ready to move on to stitching. Now that we've talked about some of our cutting basics, our grain line, and which way you should lay the pattern down on the fabric, let's talk about different prints of fabric. This print is what you would call non-directional, meaning there is no distinct top and bottom to the pattern. The opposite of that, of course, is a directional fabric, which I have an example of here. So as you can see, hopefully, all the birds are facing the same direction on this fabric. So when I'm cutting my masks on this fabric, I just have a remnant here. So it's a tiny amount left over from an old project. When you're cutting on a directional fabric, it's very important that you make sure the top of your pattern is the same direction as the top of your pattern. So for us, this edge is the top, this edge is the front, this edge is the back or the side, and this edge is the bottom. So for this example, we would not want to lay our pattern pieces like this. And unfortunately, out of this little remnant of fabric, this is the best possible arrangement of these pieces. Now, if you don't happen to have several of these patterns cut out like I do, what you can do to save yourself a little bit of time is lay your pattern down. I'm using my pin cushion here as a weight. And then you can take a marking tool. Since this is going to be the cut edge of your fabric, you could even use a ballpoint pen. I'm using a marking pencil. And again, you want to make sure the back edge or the bottom edge of your fabric is lined up with your grain line, which is going this way. You can see on this fabric and on this fabric, they both have what's called the selvage edge. That's this edge here that has usually the company information, some of the color codes, and sometimes if you're really lucky, it'll also list the fiber content of the fabric. So, once you've got this all traced, which is going to take me a minute. Once you've got this all traced, you can pick up your pattern piece and put another one right below it. Now, before we do too much more, you want to go ahead and pin close to the edges of where your pattern is marked. And that way, you know that your fabric isn't shifting too much as you're moving things and laying things out. So if I was going to cut this fabric out right this second, what I would do is repeat that process for as many times as I wanted to cut this mask pattern out. Go all the way as far as I want down, and then just come back in here with my scissors and cut around the outside line. But what I'm going to show you now is how we can perhaps get a little bit more out of a non-directional fabric. So, like I said before, this fabric does not have a distinct top and bottom. This pattern's pretty psychedelic and absolutely non-directional. So what I'm going to do, and this is an example of another thing that I'd like to show you. So you can see here that the edges of my fabric are not at all even. And when you're folding your fabric, you want to make sure that your folded edge is even and that there aren't any. Let me see if I can word this a little better. So I usually line up the selvage edge and then shake my fabric out a little bit and then let the fold fall where it will. So if you do that and then these edges aren't even, don't worry, that's okay. What you want to make sure you do at that point then is put your pattern right along the edge of your shortest piece. Of course, if you put your pattern against the longer piece, if you then pin these together and cut this out, your top piece of fabric would be too short, and then you would be sad, and you would be short pieces. So don't be sad. I'm going to show you how to nest these pattern pieces with the several pieces that I already have cut out just for time's sake. So I'm going to pin these right to the fabric and also so you can see it a little clearer. So this would make the outside of one mask. And as you've hopefully seen, it's important that when you're putting your masks together, you are using different fabric for the outside and the inside, so that when our medical professionals in particular put these on, they can quickly tell what side of the mask is supposed to go against their face. So for me, I'm using all of my printed fabric as outside fabric and any solid color fabric I have as lining fabric. So these are all going to be outside pieces. So here's what I wanted to show you. You can see that we could fit probably a third pattern piece here. So when it comes to placing our pattern pieces on this next row, since this is not a directional fabric, the cool thing we can do is flip our pattern upside down and lay it like this. And that allows us to stretch this fabric just a little further when it comes to how many masks we can get out of it. You would be surprised. I actually did the calculations, and it makes quite a bit of difference as far as how many masks you can get cut out. And so then, at this point, once I get these all pinned or marked, I then just want to come in with my scissors and cut around the very edge of the paper. So here's the other thing to be careful with. If you are cutting around a paper pattern, rather than marking it and pinning 2 layers of fabric together to cut it, you want to make sure that you're very, very careful not to cut into the edge of your paper pattern. And you can actually see where there's been a little bit of that happening here. So the reason you want to be careful about that is that if your pattern gets cut down too much here, for example, the sides of your mask, as you sew them together and this edge gets trimmed down, are progressively going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. And we want to make sure that we keep these masks as consistent as we possibly can. So I'm pretty sure most of you can probably figure out how to use scissors, but I will just show you how I cut this out just in case. I'm going to start on the edge here and not cut into the middle of something. And go as slowly as you need to make sure that you're not cutting too far into your paper, especially if you're using a paper pattern to cut around. All right, now you can see that I've got an outside mask piece cut out. I'm going to go ahead and pin these layers together because I know that they're perfectly matched right now and they're right sides together. That way, when I go to move to my machine, this is the first this is the first seam that we'll be sewing. And so that's all ready to go. I've saved myself just a little bit of time there. Okay, now that we've got our layers cut, let's move on to our next step. For the purposes of this part of the tutorial, I'm going to be using this solid green fabric for the outside layer and some unbleached muslin cotton for the lining layer. And I'm also going to be using some bright thread that doesn't match in my machine. Usually I would match the thread a little better, but I want to make sure that you all can see what I'm doing. So our first step is going to be to sew a 3/8 inch seam along the front edge of our lining piece and our outside piece. Remember to back stitch when you start stitching and also at the end. That basically knots the thread and helps make sure your stitches are secure, which is a very important part of making these masks durable. I also like to make sure that I clip all of my threads, just because I've noticed in my experience when people see loose threads, they want to pull on them, and that can also make the stitching come undone, which we definitely don't want. So after you've stitched that front, you're going to trim down about half of the seam allowance. And the reason for this is it will get rid of some of the bulk in the front of the mask and help it lay a little better over the front of their face. So you are going to do the same thing on the front of your outside piece. But for now, I'm going to set this aside to show you our next step. So we're going to take our lining piece and lay it wrong side up. So I've got my seam here facing up. And I am using a clear quilting ruler to help me get my measurements. So what we want to do is we want to measure 3/4 of an inch from this raw edge, the side of our mask. So I've got 3/4 of an inch from the side seam of the inside of the lining piece of our mask. I'm marking right along that line. So what we're going to do with that line is fold the raw edge down to meet that line, and then fold again so that that raw edge is completely encased. And what that does is it protects the fabric from fraying, which means our mask is going to last longer, be more durable against wash and wear. All right, so now that I've got that measured, folded, and pinned, I'm gonna go ahead and stitch that down. For me, this is about a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which is consistent with the rest of our mask. Okay, so next you are going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Mark it at 3/4 of an inch. And I'm using a Dritz marking tool. It's got replaceable chalk lead. Not actual lead, but you can use chalk, you can use whatever you have and are comfortable with. This mark is being made on the inside of the mask, and it ends up along the edge of the inside of the mask, so it doesn't matter too much if it's visible. All right, and we're going to sew that at 3/8 of an inch. Again, remember to back stitch. All right, so now that we've got the front of our lining and the front of our outside stitched and the sides hemmed and all the threads trimmed away, hopefully, we can move on to the next step. Okay, so now that we've done step 1, our front seam is stitched and trimmed on both pieces, and we've got both sides of our lining hemmed. What we're going to do is put these two pieces together. So I've been using my knee to help with the curvature a little bit. I put the outside piece on my knee with the clean finish facing me. And then I take my lining piece and put right sides together. So what I do is I like to match up my front seam first and pin that. Again, I know some of you like to live dangerously and not use pins, and that's fine. I won't judge you. You live your life, do what you do, but I like pins, especially on anything that has any kind of curve like this. So I'm just gonna pin my top layers, or the top edge of these layers and the bottom edge of these layers together. And I like to, just so that seam doesn't get big, I am pushing the seam allowance to one side here and to the opposite side on the other side. And that just keeps that intersection of seams there from getting too bulky and unmanageable. I like to pin the seam allowance in place so that it stays where I want it to stay. All right, and when you're done with that, if you'd like to double check some measurements to make sure that you're on the right track, you should have about 1.5 inches of fabric, of your outside fabric to the side here. This is hard to explain in words, but hopefully you see what I'm showing you. So there should be about 1.5 inches of fabric, maybe a little bit more. And we'll be using this later to create channels to put our elastic through. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to stitch those seams that we just pinned. So I'm going to take a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance at the top here where there's this curve, and a 3/8 seam at the bottom as well. Okay, now that I've got this top seam stitched and this bottom seam stitched at 3/8 of an inch, I am going to trim out the extra seam allowance just where this lining is. So we don't want to touch the outside fabric on the sides at all. We want to leave that alone. I'm just going to come in past, I kind of start past this stitch line right here, so I don't even mess with that hem at all. And again, the goal here is to get rid of some of the bulk inside of the mask. It helps it lay flat against the person's face without extra discomfort. And it will also help us a little later, and I'll point that out if I remember when I get there. So again, we're just gonna come in here. I'm starting right past that hem that we did on the lining piece. And I'm trimming our seam allowance to about half. And again, at the end here, I'm just going to avoid the stitch on that hem so we don't compromise our stitching there. And now we're going to flip this right side out. So, as you can see, everything's curving nicely and playing together well so far. We don't have any raw edges on our lining at all. And now we are going to move on to our next step. All right, I've moved you in a little closer so you can see what's about to happen here. Now that we've got our mask stitched at the top and the bottom and flipped right side out, we're going to pin the top and the bottom for top stitching. So top stitching here is important because, again, we want to encase all of our raw edges as much as possible just to make sure that these are durable. We expect them to get worn and washed a lot. You don't have to pin this before you top stitch it. I just prefer to do that personally because I feel like it gives me a crisper edge. But here's where things are going to get a little different than how they were before, and what I wanted to make sure you could see. So you'll see our outside fabric here, the inside part of our outside fabric, if that makes sense. These parts are already curling, kind of almost hemming themselves, just because of where the seam allowance was taken at the top and the bottom. So what we're going to do, again, we want to encase our raw edges as much as possible to make this durable. We're just going to let it do that natural. It should be about 3/8 of an inch. It is okay if it is not exactly 3/8 of an inch here. And we're going to tuck that raw edge under, so we're putting that seam allowance, we're folding that seam allowance in half inside of itself. So again, that makes our raw edge here completely encased, which makes this more durable. So we're going to do that all the way across the top. I'm going to do the same thing on this other side here. And I feel like, or I've experienced also, the other reason that it's helpful to trim the seam allowance out in the top and the bottom seams here is that when you go to fold that little top piece that I just folded over for the second time, the fabric fights you a little less when you fold it that second time if it's been trimmed out on the inside. And anytime we can fight a little less with our fabric, I count that as a win. Okay, so now that we've got this top part folded over so our raw edge is encased on the side and this part pinned, what we're going to do next is just run a stitch right along the edge of that fold. It should end up being about a 1/4 inch stitch if you'd like to measure on your machine. Is that right? 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch? I'm sorry, I misspoke. It should be about an 1/8 of an inch seam. so you can see what we've accomplished here is that now, again, this raw edge is completely encased and stitched down, and the outside, or the top edge of our mask, is totally secure. The other reason that top stitching is helpful is that after these are washed, if they're not top stitched, they're gonna kind of not want to lay with a crisp edge. This top stitching helps make sure that after these are washed, which we expect they will be very frequently, all our essential personnel have to do that are using them is put it on. They don't have to worry about ironing it or figuring out how to like untangle it from itself or where things are supposed to lay. So now that we finished that, we're just going to do the exact same thing on the bottom edge. Again, I like to put my finger in there and kind of push that seam out. If you would rather iron this than pin it, that's okay. You do you. Okay, and again, this is the last place where I'm just going to let it kind of do what it wants to and finger press that fold and then tuck that raw edge in so it's a double fold. All right, I'm going to stitch that and I'll meet you all at the next step. Okay, so now that we've got our masks top edge and bottom edge top stitched, what we're going to do next is we're going to create our channel. And there is a reason that we've been stitching a channel here and not stitching the elastic just directly to these edges. I will go over that at the end of this section. So what we want to do is fold this raw edge toward the lining inside of the mask at 1/4 inch. I've gotten pretty good at eyeballing standard measurements like that, but if you're a stickler and you want to take your measuring implement to it, it's right here at that line. And then once you've got that folded 1/4 inch, you're going to fold it in again so the edge that you just folded matches up with the opening of your pocket. So it should match up with the finished edge of your lining here. And then we're going to pin that in place. And I will share a little trick with you. It's important that we don't catch the lining in this stitch that we're about to make at all, because we want to make sure that these pockets stay open for our filter. So I like to just turn that edge under once, and then when I'm putting the pins in place for stitching. I'll just catch that little bit in the end there. And that way, that's well away from where I'm actually stitching. So we're going to stitch this down. And if you like to keep track of the measurement, you're stitching at 6/8 of an inch, but you just want to stitch at the very, very edge of the fold that you made to assure that there was no raw edge. Remember to back stitch. Okay, so there you see we can feed our elastic or our ties through here, but our filter pocket is still open. Trim your extra threads away, and we'll move on to our final finishing touch. Of course, do this on both sides. I already have. All right, so our very last step is going to be creating a little tiny pocket for our nose pinch. So what you want to do is, first of all, find the curved edge of your mask. This is the top. So line your center seam up and measure out 1 1/4 inch from your center seam. Let me do this the other way so maybe it's a little more visible. So 1 1/4 inch. And then we're gonna mark that. Do the same thing on the other side. 1 1/4 inch out from that center seam, so you can see where that first mark is. And then we're going to measure down from the top edge of the mask. We're going to measure down 1/2 inch. And mark that. Some of my edges are wearing away on that ruler, but it's a little easier to see. Here we go. All right. So what you should end up with is a little bit of a rectangle. So that's 1/2 inch from the top edge. So I like to save myself a little bit of time, and instead of marking with a marking tool here, I usually just put some pins in at that 1 1/4 inch mark, and then I find the 1/2 inch stitch line on my machine and just follow that. But I did want to mark it for you this time just so you could see visually, if you prefer marking, where those marks need to go, because it's a little tricky. And since this comes to a little bit of a point, I like to drop my needle down before I set my presser foot down. And then you're just going to stitch on that 1/2 inch line you just made. So, and as always, back stitch to lock your stitches in place. And trim away your extra threads. And there you go. The actual mask part of the mask is done. Good job. We've heard a lot of you saying that you are running out of elastic, and there is legitimately a shortage of elastic both in fabric stores and online, but don't panic because I'm going to show you how to make ties out of fabric. Now, this fabric is a great example. As you can see, I can fit enough mask patterns on this side to get masks all the way down, but I can't fit them over here. So this is also the perfect way to utilize this random little remnant of fabric. So our tie measurements are 2 inches by 32 inches long. This clear quilting ruler I have happens to be 2 inches wide. My favorite kinds usually are. I'm going to mark this using a ballpoint pen so that you can see it. That's fine if you're marking a cut line, although I would not usually use something like this. It is solely for your benefit. Ooh. Make sure your ruler doesn't slide around. So I'm marking my 2 inch width. Like I said, this clear ruler happens to be 2 inches wide. If you don't have a clear ruler, a quilting ruler, you can take your measuring tape and just use your lines here to mark every so often. Slide this up a little bit so you can see it. So mark your width every so often. And I'm marking my width right against the selvage edge here. Really, I could probably mark into the selvage edge, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. And then our length needs to be 32 inches. So I'm just going to match the very edge of my measuring tape up with the raw edge of the top of my fabric. And I'm going to measure 32 inches. Now, if you've got a little bit of fabric like this that is a little bit short, you can mark this as short as 28 inches. These ties will be going around the head rather than behind the ears, and different people have different sized heads. So we're finding that as little as 28 inches is okay. So if you've got fabric remnants that are a little short, that is okay. You can still use those. The other thing you can do, now this isn't ideal, so if you still have some long fabric remnants, I wouldn't recommend doing this first and foremost, but you can, if you have to, piece fabric together. And I will try to go over how to do that a little later once we get through the basics. So the important thing when you're marking the length of your fabric, you want to make sure your measuring tape stays consistently along the same edge. So, for example, here I've got my measuring tape lined up with the edge of the selvage edge. I wouldn't want to measure it like this on the diagonal because then that distorts how long it actually is. Doesn't matter too much here because we're not doing exact length, but I figured that was worth saying. So again, if you don't have a clear ruler to mark the way that I did up here, as you can see, hopefully, I've got some little dash marks where I've used my measuring tape. And let me see, I think I have a regular ruler in here somewhere. Well, I have this nifty L ruler that I'll demonstrate with. So if you don't have a clear quilting ruler, what you can do is just take a regular ruler or even the edge of a book, anything with a straight edge, a reliably straight edge. And you're just going to connect your dashes. So it's just like playing connect the dots. Going to make sure that all those dashes are lined up with the very edge of your straight surface and connect them until you find your length mark, which for me is right off camera, of course, right here. Don't stress yourself out. I know that I am certainly a perfectionist, so I probably fixate a little more on things like these than I need to. If your edge is not perfectly straight, if this is a little bit wobbly, it is okay. We're not going to worry about it right now. The most important thing here is that this is secure. And we'll go over how to make sure that is the case a little later. So what I've marked out here is enough to make one tie. So that's only 1/2 of what you would need to put ties in a complete mask. Then I'm going to cut right along the line that I marked. And I'm sure you noticed I only marked this side of the line, and again that's because this side of the line I used the edge of my selvage edge to notate where the edge is. So and while I'm doing this, I've got my iron heating up over here. It's starting to blink, so I'm gonna just tell it that I'm not done with it yet. Please don't turn yourself off. All right, so I'm gonna cut the rest of this out, and then I will meet you back here to show you how to iron these ties so you can take them straight to your sewing machine and not have to pin with them or fuss with them or anything. Okay, so now that we've got our 2" by 32" length of fabric cut out, I'm going to show you how to iron this so you can take it right to your sewing machine. So the first thing you want to do is fold your fabric in half lengthwise like this and iron it. And I am just matching the raw edges of fabric up as I go. Once you get it started, it'll kind of help. It'll start to fold itself to some extent. All right, so now that we've got that folded in half, we're going to open it up again and fold our raw edge to meet that crease that we just made. I'm going to start at the bottom. And then fold our other raw edge in to meet that same crease. So we're folding both of our raw edges into the center. And again, once you get this started, it is a lot easier to just kind of help it go where it wants to go as you're ironing it. Obviously, please be very careful with your iron, especially if you're using steam. Don't burn yourselves. If you get a little bit off center as you go, don't worry about it too much. You can just pick your iron up and use both hands to straighten things out a little bit. As long as you're kind of in the ballpark, you're okay. And I am picking this up and moving it also so you can just see what I'm doing as I'm doing it. Okay, so now that we've got both of our seams, our raw edges, sorry, matched into the center, all you're going to do is fold that in half along the first line that you folded it on and iron it a last time. I like to use a lot of steam because at this point you're working with a lot of layers. And steam just helps make sure that everything is laying flat. It also might help you if you offset one edge just a little bit. So you can kind of see here, they're not perfectly matched up. I've got maybe a 1/16 of an inch here. And so when you take that to your machine, you can kind of make sure if the shorter side is facing up that your line of stitching isn't, it's getting through all the layers. And that's going to be your next step. All you're going to do after this is take this to your machine and put a line of stitching all the way down your long edge. As you can see now that it's ironed, I don't even need to pin it. Even if it unfolds, which it doesn't really want to do, it'll fold right back. Now, if you've got some double fold bias tape laying around or even single fold bias tape, you can take that from this step in the process. All of this has basically already been done for you. And just run a line of stitching along that folded edge through your machine. So you're going to want to stitch along this edge where the opening is, just to keep it shut closed. And I'll show you that step next. In this video, we'll talk about how to finish the edges of our ties, as well as how to insert and secure different kinds of elastic. So all I'm going to do now is this open edge, I'm going to run a stitch down the long edge to close this off. Sometimes I like to drop my needle down near the edge. I'm just doing a 1/4 of an inch stitch here. I'm sorry, 1/8 of an inch stitch. And you probably noticed my ties have changed colors from the first two videos. We wanted to update some things and cover a couple of things that I didn't originally cover, so this is actually the second version of this video. So first we'll go over how to, now that you've got that stitch run down the long edge, how to insert your ties into your mask. So I like to use a safety pin, and all I do is stick the safety pin in the edge, short edge of the tie and close it. I usually rest the fabric that I'm pulling through a channel on the head side of the pin, because I find that if I pull too much with it against the back end of a safety pin, sometimes it gets caught in that little curly Q. So then what we're going to do is you're just going to use your safety pin kind of like a large needle to thread it through your channel. Now once you've got your ties pulled through, all you need to do then is make a knot as close to the end as you possibly can. And this serves two purposes. One, of course, it keeps the fabric from unraveling too much, and it also keeps the tie from coming out of the channel in the wash. I will say on some earlier versions of masks, I did use grosgrain ribbon, some grosgrain polyester ribbon, actually. Here it is right here. Grosgrain is this textured stuff. Unfortunately, we found out that the polyester ribbon is just too slippery. It wants to slip off of people's heads, so that is not ideal. We would really recommend that you stick with these 100% cotton ties or 100% bias fold tape. You can treat it the same way that we've treated these ties. So that is how you put your ties in your mask. And of course I'm going to do the very same thing on the other side of this mask. But since you've already seen that, I will show you how to put in a couple of different kinds of elastic. So I'm guessing probably what most of you have elastic-wise is this flat. This is a flat 1/4 inch elastic. So what we want to do first is cut that to 9 inches. And I think I mentioned this in the overview video, but just to review a bit. 9 inches does seem like it might be a little bit long for some people, but if it is a little long, they can always shorten the elastic and make the mask usable, whereas if it's too short, that's a much more difficult problem to fix. So to thread this through my channel, I'm just going to do the same thing. Sometimes with my elastic, I like to stick the safety pin through twice. Elastic is tricky and it just likes to unravel on you. And then I'm going to thread it through this channel the same way. Now, I frequently have a problem with elastic where the needle doesn't want to go through it, and the feed dogs in the machine that kind of pick the fabric up and move it along likes to get caught in the elastic and they don't want to grab it. So I have a trick for that I'll share with you. It's just a regular piece of paper, actually paper that's a little bit thicker than this loose leaf is even better. So what we're going to do first is overlap the elastic by 1/4 of an inch just a teeny tiny little bit there. And I like to stick a pin through it. I'll show you, so that it's perpendicular to the elastic. And what I'm going to do is run a zigzag stitch over this. I'll get my camera to focus, it's all confused. So I'm going to run a zigzag stitch over this, going this way. So the zigzags will go like this. And I like to stick my needle in this way because I know then this pin needs to be at the center of where I'm going to run my zigzag stitch. I know that my needle isn't going to hit it when it goes down. So you can kind of see where I've already put this through the machine a couple of times. All I'm going to do is put this elastic over the piece of paper somewhere it hasn't already been used. Switch my machine to a zigzag stitch. Again, I like to drop my needle down. And the other trick here when it comes to the flat elastic is to make sure that you don't go beyond your edges, because that thread will just end up being loose thread. And if your machine doesn't want to pull it forward, sometimes make sure your needle is dropped down. Pick it up a little bit, and then it goes right away. Sometimes it just gets caught on part of the presser foot. Okay, and then I'm going to reverse. I went ahead and took my pin out because that should be enough stitches to make sure it's secure in one direction and the elastic isn't going to slip. So I like to go back and forth 2 or 3 times. And then, and if there's a little bit of paper left underneath, that's okay. So anytime I stitch elastic, I like to pull on it to make sure that is secure, it's not going anywhere. And so I mentioned before, you want to make sure you don't go over this edge or this edge when you're stitching, because then that ends up being loose thread, and when you cut it, it's more loose ends to unravel, basically. But we've stitched this through, we've pulled on it, we know it's secure, so that's good. And all you do is slip this into the channel. And so the last thing we have is this round elastic. So I did try to stitch this, and while it is possible, to me personally, it just didn't feel very secure. When I pulled on it, it came undone right away, and I just didn't really like that. So, what I'm going to do with this instead, and you can do the same trick with this, but it's even easier to just, since this is a little more rigid, just push it through. So what I'm going to do with this is tie it in a square knot. So I'll demonstrate this for you twice, just in case you've never tied a square knot before. That is right over left, and then you pull the right side under, and then your new right side under left. And you'll know you have it right because you can kind of pull it apart and it makes this kind of shape. So try to get that as close to your ends as you possibly can, but still secure. Again, I like to pull on it, make sure it doesn't feel like it's going to come undone, and then slip it to the inside of the mask. And the nice thing about that is that if the elastic does turn out to be too long, there's already a knot in it that they can then untie and retie. So I'll show you that again, just in case. And if you're having trouble with the square knot, feel free, of course you can watch this video as many times as you need to. And there's also tons of diagrams on the internet. Just Google square knot. And I'm sure the internet will be able to help you as well. And of course you can always reach out to me if you're really having trouble. Okay, so right over left, and then under, and then our new right, under left, and wrap. I know my fingers kind of make it hard to see. I'll do that again just so you can see it a third time. Okay. All right, and then again, pull it, make sure it's secure, not wanting to go anywhere, and then just loop it into your mask, and you're finished. In this video, we'll be talking about a couple of different ways to make nose pinch clips. I'm assuming what most of you are using are probably paper clips, so we'll go over that first. But I also have some large gauge jewelry wire here that I'll cover how to work with later. I'm using some needle nose jewelry pliers, and this will help me create the loops. But the first thing I'm going to do is unfold this paper clip. So if you don't have jewelry pliers exactly like this, you can make any kind of pliers work. So the goal in straightening out this paper clip is just to make it as straight as possible. And originally we were saying only use uncoated paper clips, but now HRM is specifically saying they prefer the coated paper clips. I guess they must be taking them out of the masks before they run them through the sterilizer. I'm not sure. So either coated or uncoated paper clips are fine. So when you have your paper clip unfolded, it should be 3 inches. If it's longer than that, which mine is, it's 3.5 inches, take some wire cutters and cut it down to 3 inches. And my advice anytime you're using wire cutters is to hold one end and aim the other end, if there's 2 short ends, down. Because the shorter end will go flying. If you don't, that is speaking from personal experience. And then all you're going to do is take the very edge of your paper clip, and since I've got these needle nose pliers, I can just wrap it around the edge, and your loop should be just big enough. All we want to do is make sure that those pointy ends are pointed back in toward themselves so they can't hurt anyone or get caught on anything. And our second loop should be going in the same direction. All right. So make sure that your finished nose pinch clip is 2.5 inches. That's really important because the stitch that we're making to hold the nose pinch clip in place is right at 2.5 inches. It should be 1.25 inches on either side of the center seam. And what this does is when you put your nose pinch clip in the side, you can hook these loops around the edges of your seam of your stitch, and that'll hold it in place and keep it from sliding around. So if you are working with floral wire or large gray jewelry wire like this, the process is going to be very much the same. Cut your wire to 3 inches. Again, I recommend that you hold the short end or point it down. And I will say, when I was first doing this, I was putting my wire down all the way to the edge here. But the loops need to be as small as possible. So now I'm putting my wire closer to the top so the loop is smaller. And when you feel your nose pinch clip after you've got a loop, it should be smooth. So you don't want the wire resting on one side or the other. You want it right in the middle. We're going to do the other side on this in the same direction, so that both of our loops are pointing up or pointing down. When we put these in our mask, we want these pointing down. So again, I'll measure this, and it's right at 2.5 inches. So perfect. And let me show you how to put this into a mask. This is one of my earlier masks. So you might notice that this one doesn't have channels, and that is wrong. Okay, so when you put this in your mask, you want to put it in loop side down. All you're going to do is slip it into the side, and there's a stitch line right here. You're going to put it right on top of that stitch line. And sometimes I have a little bit of trouble around the center seam. You just kind of have to pull the nose pinch clip back and forth until it goes through. Eventually it will. And then, like I said, if your nose pinch clip and your stitch are the right size, you can kind of hook it around the edges. Although I find even when I don't do that, it stays in place very well. And there you go. And you can even see, since this is white fabric, where it's sitting.